now I want to move to talk about the legal aspect and consider first, how does the law affect the well-being of the people as they go through the process, as far as, how they feel about it, how they are protected, and how could the law become better in that regard. And to begin that conversation, I want to ask Attorney Steve Snyder from IARC to talk to us about this issue. He is the chair of the Reproductive and Genetic Technology Committee of the American Bar Association, and also is the liaison to the National Coalition for the Oversight of Assisted Reproduction Technology of the same organization, and has been, and as he'll tell you in a minute, party to a lot of efforts and processes to improve and set laws and standards in the practice of assisted reproduction and specifically surrogacy.
Legislation 101. I'm looking at the materials here in the Child Parent Security Act. Asks, why is New York on the list of the most restrictive states? So I want to just kind of give you a background on how legislation got started in this area. At this point, we have to go back to what was the law before surrogacy ever existed. How did they establish parents? They established parents based on presumptions. And in the 1950s, if you gave birth, you were the mom. You were the mom. And if you were married, you were presumed to be the father, although that might not always be the case. So they created a system of establishing parentage by presumption. Certain people were entitled to assert parentage. The woman who gives birth, the guy she was married to, the milkman that got in the way. And in some cases, if you could establish genetic relationship as the mother, you also got a presumption, right? So, back in the early days of surrogacy, all surrogacy was done through artificial insemination. So we had a woman giving birth that was the birth mother and was the genetic mother, and there was nobody else that was in there to contest her maternity. So even heterosexual couples that tried to assert parentage had a problem. Gay couples certainly would have had a problem. So the first case, Baby M in 1987, was a case where a traditional surrogate, who was the genetic and birth mother of the child, wanted to keep the baby. And under the existing law at that time, there wasn't a way to ignore that. That was the law. The people that are creating these rules and enforcing them at that time are people that were familiar with the old way of establishing parentage. In fact, the judges that you go in front of if you have an argument with a surrogate today are still those same judges. These judges aren't educated as art attorneys or art judges or sophisticated in medical fertility procedures. They look retrospectively at the law, and the law says the woman who gives birth is generally the mom, and if we have a dispute, we're going to resolve it based on the best interests of the child. Meaning, if you get into an argument in a surrogacy arrangement without a legislative structure like the New York statute, what you're looking at is a court that's not familiar with surrogacy, didn't have to use assisted reproduction to have kids, trying to decide where is it best for the kid to go. And that could be the surrogate. She might be a better parent, a better home. So retrospectively, legislation gave us very little grounds to enforce surrogacy arrangements. And that's what we're trying to overcome by passing new laws that look at the realities of surrogacy and the fact that families are no longer being created based on biology or genetics, but they're being created based on intent. All right? So when you have legislation, what is it that you want to try to accomplish? And why is it that New York has to struggle all by itself to have its law? That's because parentage is a strictly state issue. It is not a federal issue, and every state is entitled to determine how parentage is created in all circumstances in that state. So New York, after Baby M, was one of the 10 states that said, oh my God, look at this surrogacy case. We certainly don't want that happening here. Let's pass a law to outlaw it. And back in the late 1980s, they did. And that was based on the use of traditional surrogacy, where women were using their own eggs and were being artificially inseminated and giving up their genetic children to the intended parents. So New York jumped on that bandwagon after the adverse outcome in Baby M, and then 7 years later or so in California, when gestational surrogacy took over, meaning the surrogate's not genetically related anymore, well, now she's just giving birth, and someone else can be the genetic mother. And where that's the genetic intended mother, you had two women who had equal claim, and the California courts then imposed the intent test, meaning whoever intended to be the parent got the nod. So that's how the use of the law is evolving, and based on that, various groups are trying to propose models. The first one was proposed by a national conference of uniform law commissioners, and that means two people from each state get together and they propose laws that are governed by the states that should be uniform. And they came up with the Uniform Parentage Act, and what the Uniform Parentage Act said is surrogacy should be enforceable, but you should have your contracts judicially pre-approved by a judge before you ever start the process, and if you do after the fact, the surrogate's got to ratify her waiver of parental rights, and then you can do surrogacy. It allows compensated surrogacy. It does not allow gay surrogacy. So the American Bar Association took up the challenge and over 17 years developed an ever-changing model act that essentially followed the same process but also incorporated some newer things. So over time, some general models from the Uniform Law Commissioners and the American Bar Association have been proposed, but each state that addresses the issue is taking it up individually and pulling a little bit from here and a little bit from there. So the bottom line is you need to pass a law. You need to stop criminalizing surrogacy in New York. You need to have structure. And what the law generally does in order to improve the participation is it decides who can participate. The New York law does allow for same-sex couples to take advantage of surrogacy. Now, I'm going to say some things about the New York law, and before I do that, I'm going to say, Melissa, raise your hand. She's on the committee that's working on the New York law. So if you really want to know what the New York law is, that woman right over there is a great expert resource, and go over and chat with her. And Melissa, if I say anything wrong, throw something at me, okay? So it does allow for same-sex surrogacy. That's a huge advancement. Why do you want legislation? To overcome the old ways of establishing parentage and make your intent enforceable. So the general rules of legislation are who can participate. The New York law says you can participate. Then it says, what does it mean to participate safely? What are the reasonable gates that you have to go through? For a surrogate, it's informed consent. You have to have had a child. How can you consent to a process of giving up a child after you give birth if you've never done it? So that's part of the informed consent process. You have to go through a psychological evaluation, meaning are you suitable for the process? Can you psychologically and emotionally say, yes, I can give up this baby and without causing myself any emotional harm? That's informed consent. You have to go through various legal contracts, and it's required that you have one, and you have to have an independent lawyer that gives you your separate view of whether this is or isn't in your best interest. So the law tends to put in place things that protect the safety of the surrogate. And then the law has to decide what are your qualifications. Some laws, like the Illinois statute, say that you can only use a surrogate if you're physiologically unable to have your own gestation. Well, that might not necessarily apply to you, but it might. So it's better if it just says whether it's social or physiological surrogacy, whether you medically or socially can't have a child, that you're entitled to participate. Some of them say that at least one parent has to be genetically related to the child. So the bottom line is you need the New York statute because it will make the outcome of your process what you intend to be. The biggest reason to have legislation is because intent has not previously been incorporated into parentage laws. You're not protected when you start this process, and legislation is the only way to bootstrap you into a reliable outcome in your process, whereby you know when you start the process, at the end of it, you will be granted legal parentage and nobody can prevent your access to the process. Next.
So terrific. I think we all get a sense of how the law can not just make our lives easier, but also make the various parties safer. And I think, at least from our previous conversation, also, feel better, knowing exactly what's going to happen. Adjust expectations, make us all make things more predictable, and make the child have more certain parents and less haphazard way to becoming. To having those parents recognized. So next, we're gonna start talking more about this context, which is if we know that there are ways to make surrogacy safer and more in line with everybody's well-being and interests and more protected, how does that potential model or ideal? Everybody's looking at how you're going to find the thing. Look at me until he finds it. So everybody, how close are we to that ideal that there'll be laws that help make sure that everybody's protected and everybody's ready and everybody's interests are being taken into effect. So we have, fortunately, Gabriel Blau here with us. He's the Executive Director of Family Equality Council. And they've been involved with many of such, efforts around the country, since this is one of the major ways gay parents in particular, even though surrogacy is not just a gay issue, are attempting to become parents. So I'll let Gabriel speak for a few minutes about this, and then we'll continue to our last speaker.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's so amazing to see so many people who are taking the time to really research how they want to create their families. I mean, having babies is certainly one of, an important way of gathering that information. So I'm going to be quick. The reason I pulled up our website is because I wanted to show you a resource that we're going to talk about a little bit. So we've heard a lot about what it means to our children and ourselves to have to create our families through surrogacy. I'm a father myself. I have a 6.5-year-old. We've talked about some of the issues, the actual medical issues, because surrogacy is a medical procedure, or is a set of medical and legal procedures that come together. And so we've talked about all of that. So now the question is, as we start thinking about the laws and how we protect our families, is what's going on for LGBTQ-headed families around the country and how it affects us. Many families that we work with create their families in a variety of ways. So they may have a child from a heterosexual marriage or relationship, they may co-parent, there may be 3 parents involved, they may adopt through foster care, they may foster a child after they've had a child through surrogacy. We call these blended families. And what's really amazing about our community is that we create families in such a wide variety of ways that we're challenged, and I think it's a great thing, that we are challenged to explain to the rest of the country and the rest of the world how family law should be structured. So the first thing I want to say is that in New York, we are, LGBTQ people are one of the most, it's one of the places where we are most protected. And with that in mind, New York law for our community is very poor. Very, very poor, especially family law. Family law is very weak for our families here. It has to do with some of what we've heard: culturally competent lawyers, culturally competent government clerks, doctors and institutions that are able to serve, which is why it's so important to work with an agency, a doctor, or a lawyer who really understand your issues. And we deal with this at Family Equality around the country. We meet parents who will call us or find, I'll actually get emails. People will find my email address, and I'll get emails from families who are all over the country suddenly dealing with something, and they don't know where to turn because they ended up going with a lawyer who was a friend, or a lawyer who they met who didn't really know how to shepherd this process through. And that's also what makes it so complicated and why you have to spend all day in the basement. Finally, a little reaction from this group. So that's the first thing to understand. Now, I don't say that to scare you. I say that to acknowledge that creating our families is a political issue. it's a legal issue, and of course, most importantly, it's a personal issue. So I'm going to consider everything I say now an introduction to a colleague that I respect very much, who's a real leader in this country, and we get to work with state organizations around the country, which is one of the greatest parts of my job. But here in New York, we're very lucky, and I'm a New Yorker, to have Empire State Pride Agenda that has a long history of strength and really going up against one of the most difficult state legislatures in the country, which people don't realize about New York. So everything I say now is an introduction to Nathan and what ESPA's doing. And so I'm going to try to set the stage. So because we're involved in the law that we've talked about a little bit, and Melissa, hi, it's good to see you again. And we try to support laws like this around the country. So we've gotten laws in California, and there's a law we don't like in Illinois. There's a Louisiana law that we were very concerned about, and now there's a potential that it'll go our way. We have a law here, we have Maryland and DC. Well, DC now, Maryland we got. But what I wanted to show you is what the whole country looks like. So on our website, we have a section under Get Informed called Equality Maps. And I urge you to go, because what you need to understand when you're creating a family, not through being a heterosexual couple that has a glass of wine, sex, and produces a child, and I imagine that that's how it works, right? That you're most likely, and certainly if you're a New York resident, your process of creating a family is going to involve multiple states. Okay? And therefore, it's going to involve lawyers from each of those states, often, depending on who you work with and what bar they're admitted to. And it's going to involve doctors in different states. In some states, you're going to also have to use an adoption agency, not just a lawyer, to do the second parent, depending on where the child is born. So you really have to understand what's going on in the country. Also, and this is really important, we are a movement. We are a community. So our organization, the Family Equality Council, is responsible for all of you. We serve a constituency of 9 million, it's 3 million LGBTQ Americans who are parents, and they have 6 million children. That's from the most recent census data. Our staff has been working with the Census Bureau so that the upcoming census is going to have better questions to help all of us understand our constituency better. But we are a movement, and we need to be fighting for this, because however you create your family, we have to use this shared experience as a way to advance not just laws for our family, but for all families. So again, like I said, New York, backdrop here, New York is really bad on family law. It's really one of the most difficult states to get a child out of foster care. It's one of the most difficult states to get clear guidance from an attorney, from a judge when you go into a family court. For our families, it's not just LGBT issues, but for LGBT people, we have almost no explicit protections. Okay, so that's the next thing that you need to understand. So I'm going to show you a map now that's going to help explain this. Whoops. Okay, so every surrogacy family that includes more than one parent, is an adoption case. And in fact, you can argue in some sort of esoteric way that even if you are one intended parent, it's an adoption case in the sense that adoption involves severing another parent's right to parental rights. And so we all end up becoming basically adoptive families in one form or another. So this map, well, that's foster care. Let me show you. So this is a map of second parent adoptions in America. And what you can see is that despite everything we've gained in marriage, second parent adoption in this country is a minefield. The most important part of this map is the white states. What that is, so we face explicit legal restrictions in the sort of orange states, but in the white states, there's no law. So you're reliant on case law, you're reliant, as you are, for example, in Georgia and Texas, very well known for this, by what judge you end up with. And in fact, and this is a really important thing to understand, is that while you'll hear stories from people who, friends of mine just had a child in Texas, I think they're still there, through surrogacy. If you go to the right judge with the right lawyer, with your petition written the right way, no problem. You go to the wrong judge with the wrong lawyer, and you will find, as two of our constituents, Jason and Joe, found out the hard way a few months ago, you can end up not only with not getting your rights to be parents, but actually with the surrogate having more rights than they would normally have. So it's really, really important to work with the right people. Now, the agencies that you work with will be able to guide you through this. And if they can't or don't know how to talk about this, go the other way. And I'm sure everybody here can take care of that for you. But these states are the scariest ones. Okay? Now, on the other hand, we also have issues with the green states. The green states are where we can petition for second parent adoption, but if family law isn't caught up to how our families are being created, if lawyers and judges aren't prepared to serve our families, you can still run into issues. We hear about this all the time when new parents are going for Social Security cards. All the time. And we've been working very closely with the SSA, with the Social Security Administration, to fix this. They have the right policies, but their clerks don't know how to deal with our families. Okay, so that's a really, really important thing to remember. Now, surrogacy, as we heard, is only protected for our families in a handful of states. So most of the states that you're going to go, and most of the states where our friends are having children, you're able to do that only by working with the right people, because you're not fully protected. The New York law, for example, that we're trying to pass here is modeled after the California law, sort of. At this point, who knows what it's modeled after? It's modeled after Albany. But originally started trying to replicate the California law, which is which we consider to be a very good law. However, California is not New York, and California has other things in place to protect its families, right? So that's a really, really, really key piece here. Now, there's another piece to this, the lived equality piece. Our work as a community, as a movement, has to be towards not just achieving our legal rights, but actually achieving our lived equality, or our social rights. Because the people who administer the law, right, are only doing it on a case-by-case basis. Right? So Albany can pass a law for the whole state, but ultimately you interact with the law as an individual, and you do so with a lawyer and a judge. Right? So you have to have lived equality in order to address the things that that lawyer and that judge can't address. When we look at how children of LGBTQ parents, no matter how they're brought into the world or how they're brought into their families, are treated, what we're really asking is not whether, we're no longer really asking, can LGBTQ people be good parents? The debate is over on that. What we're really asking is, do these situations create an environment in which children are unable to thrive? And it's not because of the parent's sexuality. I mean, every study has proven that we make as good parents. The question is, what happened? So we were talking earlier, Stephen and I were talking about the study in the UK, where the United Kingdom is very different from the US. And in the US, raising a child in Manhattan is very different from Western New York, or from Alabama, where family equality does a lot of work, or Georgia, or even California, and different parts of California are different. So we have to not just focus on the laws, but actually focus on developing communities and support systems. And that's a really key thing that you'll hear from any parent. And every year we do what's called the National Family Equality Survey. And in that survey, we always ask, what do you want? And what's interesting is no matter how we break up the results, what parents, especially new parents, say is we want to meet other parents like us. No matter where they live, no matter how much money they have, no matter, right, they live in Chelsea and they're billionaires, and they still want to be in a community with other parents like them. And what that helps us understand is that our families are reliant on the same community structures that other families are reliant on. Okay, so let me bring this all together so that you can hear from Nathan about what we're going to do about it here in New York. What this all comes down to is that even in a state like New York, in order for us to achieve our equality, we have to be looking not just at what it takes to pass a law, which is incredibly difficult in this state. In fact, we find it more difficult to get laws passed in New York than we do in states like Alabama, where we're not getting any laws passed anytime soon, but theoretically it's easier. Instead, what we have to be thinking about is how we work as a community to pass this law with the understanding that even as it's not passing, we're creating conversations that creates better schools, more culturally competent care at all levels, so that our families then can thrive. Because you can do surrogacy just not in this state. We want you to do it here. We want you to be able to do it here. But once we create that environment, then that law will pass. And when Melissa and I and Nathan and I were up in Albany a few months ago, we watched a state senator really turn from somebody who we thought was really against us to hearing these stories, listening to surrogates and their experience, hearing from parents, including her fellow Senator Brad Hoylman, and you could see her questions changing as she was talking. You could hear them, and she started to understand what this is really about. And that's something you don't accomplish with legal language. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce one of our biggest state partners right here in New York, Nathan Schaefer.
Just to be clear, when we say that New York is one of a few states, New York is the worst state in the country because it would impose criminal penalties if you were to engage in a contractual surrogacy arrangement. And there was a lot of pressure. Of course, it was a reaction to the Baby M case from the 1980s. And to give you a little indication of how strongly the government in New York responded, it was actually in 1992 that a bill was forced through the legislature by Governor Mario Cuomo at the time. It's actually called what's called a program bill. He did it through a budget, which is a very strong way of getting a lot of support for a prohibition like this. So what this means at present for couples like many of you who desire to create a family and to engage with a surrogate to do so is that you have to travel out of state to do so, which of course adds travel and expense and stress to what is already, of course, a very stressful time. It also can mean for many families that they are traveling to states that don't have basic non-discrimination ordinances in place. I was just speaking with someone who became a board member at the Pride Agenda about his experience creating his family, and he went to Kansas to work with a surrogate there to have his child. And again, these are places where we don't even have basic protections from discrimination. So. And of course, it's a complete missed opportunity. Who have, we're thankful to benefit from some of the best legal and medical institutions in the country, and of course, it's just a complete missed opportunity for New York on so many levels. So where we are with the bill, the Child Parent Security Act, it's relatively new in its current iteration, and it's being led in the New York State Assembly by Assembly Member Amy Paulin. And that's great because Amy is not only a very strong and committed advocate, but she does have personal experience with IVF when she had her third child, so she does speak from a bit of a personal perspective. And then on the Senate side, as Gabriel mentioned, it's being led by Senator Brad Hoylman, who's the only openly gay member of the New York State Senate, and he and his husband went to California to have their child, who's very cute. Her name is Sylvia. She just turned 5. So he also can speak from personal experience, and he's been getting quite a lot of media coverage. There was a pretty comprehensive piece in the Times, I think in March of this year. And they sort of tag team, and Amy's straight and Brad's gay, and that allows us an opportunity to remind the legislature that we're not just talking about an LGBT issue here. So we had the forum back in April. Gabriel and I were happy to participate, as did Melissa. We were there for 4 hours and had lots of experts like those that are here convened today. And I will tell you that the most effective messenger during those 4 hours was a woman who served as a gestational carrier. And I think what we have to continue to do moving forward is to get women who have served as gestational carriers to speak with the legislature, because we do have to combat this ongoing misperception that the process is exploitive of women. We all know that that is not the case, but we have to carry that message very strongly within the legislature. So while we haven't seen it move in committee yet, we have been building support. We've been adding more and more co-sponsors to the legislation. In the Assembly, we've now got 28. In the Senate, we've got 14. What that means is that that member of the legislature will not only vote for the bill, but they'd be willing, hopefully, to speak with their colleagues about it. It's a way of getting them to be publicly, to be public about their support. And Melissa did allude to the Republican leadership within the state Senate, which is a challenge for many reasons, but it's not the only challenge, and I would argue it's not the main challenge here. I would argue that the main challenge of getting the Child Parent Security Act passed in Albany is the fact that we don't have term limits in New York State. The chair of the Judiciary Committee, Assemblymember Helene Weinstein, was one of the most strongest and vocal proponents of the prohibition back in the early 1990s. She's still the chair. And try as we might, I don't think we have successfully or fully educated her and her staff, and by extension some of her colleagues on the committee, about the distinctions of traditional surrogacy, which was the case with the Baby M case, and gestational carrier arrangement, which is what we're talking about with this piece of legislation. We will keep at it, but folks can serve in Albany for as long as they are reelected. And so I do think that that's one of the challenges. Why I am optimistic about the coming year, Gabriel mentioned there was a specific senator who did come to the forum, and you could see a light bulb going off in her mind, and that is Senator Diane Savino, who's a member of the Independent Democratic Conference. She represents parts of Brooklyn and Staten Island, and she is the ranking member on the Children and Families Committee within the New York State Senate, and she used to be the chair. There is a chance, we will see what happens on Tuesday, but there is a chance that the Senate could flip and be democratically controlled, in which case Diane Savino will, in all likelihood, be the chair of the relevant committee in the New York State Senate, and she's a co-sponsor of the bill. So what could actually happen here on a bill that's being led by many LGBT advocates is we could see movement in the Senate before we see it in the Assembly, which to somebody like me is just hilarious. But that actually could happen next year. So the final thing I'll mention is that there is a task force in New York State of experts on issues of bioethics. It's called the Task Force on Life and the Law. They are a number of experts that are appointed by the governor. They were one of the bodies that recommended the prohibition back in the early 1990s, and they've been taking meetings and hearing from folks about the changes over the many, many years, and they are expected to issue a recommendation, I hope, before the end of the year, which I think will then influence Governor Cuomo's position, which we still don't have him publicly yet. Melissa, please.
Spoken to the committee twice, and I'm speaking to them again in 2 weeks, and I'm pretty sure, although I couldn't give you a guarantee, that it will be a positive opinion. I wanted to say that I didn't mean to be so negative about the bill, but I think that most lay people don't understand that it takes a long time. So I wouldn't get too excited that this is going to help you if you want to start your family now. This is something that is going to be down the line, and when you do legislation, it's not a 1 or 2 year plan, it's more like a 5 to 10 year plan. And people call my office and say, oh, I see on your committee, when's it going to apply to me? And I think that's not going to happen. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that you could do a surrogacy in New York. I think one of the things as a professional is sometimes we don't realize that we know a lot more than the people here, so we don't explain that you could do a surrogacy in New York if it was uncompensated. It's not illegal to do surrogacy, it's just illegal to do it for pay.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You can do what's called a compassionate surrogacy, but yeah, I'll be really quick. Yes, I do think that the task force recommendation will be favorable, and I agree, it's not going to be done next year. We are talking about a multi-year campaign. We might see significant legislative process next year, so it won't apply to your families, but that doesn't mean we don't need your help to come to Albany and help us lobby for passage of the bill. Thank you so much.
We haven't finished our study of the gay surrogacy families yet, so I can't really answer your question, but I think it's a very good point that we know from other studies of children what really matters is parents talking to them from as early as possible about their origins. So I think that probably will make a difference from what we know about other families, but we really need this the study of gay fathers to happen, and then we'll have an answer.
In the LGBT community, there's no such thing as an accidental pregnancy, right? Our children all plan, wanted, desire, highly awaited. In the States, 50 to 60% of pregnancies are unplanned, or not necessarily undesired, but unplanned. And that makes a huge difference. This is why I think the kids will be all right in our case. But in your group of control of spontaneous conception, was this controlled for the all planned pregnancies, IVF pregnancy, or like just randomly chosen spontaneous pregnancies?
So usually in In our comparison groups, we do try and find heterosexual couples who've tried to get pregnant, who've had, would have been classified as infertile in that they spent more than a year trying to get pregnant, perhaps had drug treatment and so on, but then became pregnant spontaneously. But it's a very good point. It's important to control for that, for whether or not the child is planned. But I think that does explain the more positive findings from all the studies we do, is that these, as you say, they're planned, they didn't happen by accident, they're very wanted children, and I think that's really the main factor across all of the studies that explains the positive outcomes.
This was fascinating, and it just means that we're going to have some more conversations like this. I think it's all, we understand that the legislative process is going to take a while, so we might have opportunity for a few more of these. I think one theme that emerged out of this, as far as I could see from here, is that, if there is a connection between the legal and the medical and the psychological, and the fact that the law is such that we cannot live close to where the surrogates are, could at the very least be a factor in all of those three. There are more moving parts. It's going to hard to coordinate the medical process. It's going to make the medical process more expensive. It's going to make the relationships between whatever they're comfortable with be more difficult. Maybe motivation levels are going to be affected, but certainly people's satisfaction levels and feeling about this whole process could be affected by distance. So we're certainly very, very hopeful. Thank you so much for the distinguished and interesting panel.